Well, I finally did it. After 3 months of skimming through everything Wikipedia has to offer on Chinese emperors, I have put together a ranking of every emperor from Qin Shi Huang to Puyi. Just a couple of things before we begin the list. First of all, I'm only counting emperors from these dynasties. Second of all, I'm only counting people who were officially in power. Also, this list is entirely subjective. If you disagree with any of the things on my list, feel free to. Finally, if anyone who's actually Chinese is watching this, I am sorry for how badly I messed up the pronunciation of half of these guys' names. Without further ado, let's begin. Number 131, Qin Shi. This guy inherited a somewhat stable empire and he ran it immediately into the fucking ground. Well, actually he didn't really inherit it. He plotted with Zhao Gao and Li Si to straight up usurp the throne over the person who was actually supposed to succeed. He would spend the entirety of his tenure as emperor living in decadence and luxury, and he ruled tyrannically along with Zhao Gao, who amassed more and more power. On top of that, the people who actually told him what bad things were going on in the empire were straight up executed for bringing him bad news. This eventually culminated in massive rebellions across the Qin dynasty and ended up in it getting overthrown, to the point where the person who succeeded Qin Shi had to claim the title of king instead of emperor. Basically, he fucked up everything that his father worked hard for. Number 130, Sui Yangdi. Basically, he is exactly like the last guy. He inherited a prosperous, stable empire, and he immediately proceeded to bankrupt it with his decadent lifestyle, making endless palaces, and he also levied heavy taxes and conscripted people to go on endless conquests, which all culminated in 3 failed invasions of Korea. He ran the empire into the ground so quickly that it immediately fell apart right after he died. At least the dynasty after him was fantastic. Number 129. Qin Xiaowu. Some people watching this video may recognize him as the guy who was ruling the entire Qin dynasty during the Battle of Fei River, in which they managed to inflict a decisive defeat against former Qin. You may be asking at this point, well, why is he so low then? Well, first of all, he was actually under regency at the time of this. Second of all, as soon as he took the reins of power, he immediately indulged in sex, drinking, opulence. He named his severely intellectually disabled son as his heir, despite precedents of that being a bad thing to do. And he threw away every chance of the Qin dynasty surviving after the Battle of Fei River. The Qin dynasty would soon collapse after his son came to power, and he got murdered by one of his concubines. Imagine going like that. Number 128, Song Duzong. He led a life of luxury while China was plagued with rebellions, and he left everything to the corrupt Xia Xidao. Do you guys notice a pattern yet? Also, he did nothing about the Mongol invasion, and a lot of the people that he trusted with it actually made the entire situation worse. I think we all know how this would end. Number 127, Han Lingdi. Basically, he indulged in heavy drinking and sex while eunuchs ran the entire empire, something which will become a trend amongst the worst emperors among this list. He financed construction projects while officials literally fucking murdered each other. He sold political positions for cash money, increasing corruption and rotting the core of the Han dynasty, and his apathy towards plagues and bad harvests plaguing the countryside would lead directly to the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and this contributed greatly to the collapse of the Han dynasty. Number 126. The Xianfeng Emperor. At this point in time, the century of humiliation was in full swing, with the Taiping and Yan rebellions plaguing the entire dynasty, and while they would eventually be put down, they would do massive damage towards its standing. On top of that, he was unwilling to compromise with Anglo-French forces, despite being in a much worser position, which eventually led to the Second Opium War and a further decline in living standards. On top of all of this, he lived a life of overindulgence and opulence. His unwillingness to realize that China had to adapt to the modern world and how they were running things would eventually cause the Qing dynasty's condition and later regimes over China to spiral out of control. Number 125, the Daoguang Emperor. He remained blind to the glaring internal technological issues China was facing, and actually scratched the technological, He was straight up ignorant about the eternal issues, and he preferred to live in ignorance instead of actually doing meaningful reform in order to fix the country so that it would adapt. This resulted in China getting anally raped by Great Britain in the First Opium War, and this led directly to the Taiping Rebellion and a century of humiliation. Number 124. Han Huandi. He spent the first part of his reign under the regency of Empress Dowager Liang. There was a metric fuck ton of political intrigue. He also conspired with his several eunuchs to get rid of the powerful Liang Zi after a string of scandals, but because of this, the eunuchs would become much more powerful and much more corrupt, and all he did was basically enable all of that. On top of that, he sold minor positions for money. All of this would lead to the disasters of the partisan prohibition. So basically, he's an early version of the fifth worst person on this list. Number 123. Song Lizong. His actual reign was dominated by various eunuchs, several other officials, and Empress Dowager Yang. However, he also did nothing to improve the situation of the Song dynasty, and he was only interested in going to brothels, drinking wine, and making art. And all of this was while the Mongols were breathing down the Song dynasty's throat. Number 122. Tong Yizong. He lived a life of opulence while people were taxed heavily and they were starving. He also handed out government positions like they were fucking candy, even bestowing positions on musicians. He drained the treasury that his father had accumulated, and at this point in time, agrarian rebellions were plaguing the country. Number 121. The Tianzi Emperor. Okay, this guy is down this low because of his sheer fucking incompetency. Get this, he was fucking illiterate. Emperor of China. Emperor of an intensely centralized bureaucratic country. Illiterate. No, I'm not going to forgive him for this, unlike some other emperors who also had their faults, because this guy is the literal fucking richest man in the entire country at this point in time. How the fuck did he not know how to read? Take a good guess at how this went. That's right. Eunuchs were just like, hey, man, what's up? You know what? Since you can't read, we'll read for you. And then proceeded to issue their own shit. Living conditions worsened, uprisings started to happen, and the Ming dynasty was going to its end. Apparently he was a pretty good carpenter though. Number 120. Wang Mang. Before rising to the position of emperor, he slowly got more and more power until he straight up usurped the throne. After this, he tried to make a system that would function just like the earlier Shang and Zhou dynasties. Problem is, no one really knew how the fuck they functioned. I mean, Chinese records are good, but they're not that good. In order to try to accomplish the system, all land was briefly made property of the state. Wait a fucking second. He tried to introduce a new currency. He tried to assert authority over neighbors, and all of this failed. Corruption quickly became widespread, while the wars being fought to trying to assert authority over their neighbors were all being lost. And this resulted in various rebellions, culminating in the Qimei and Lulin rebellions, which all saw him overthrown. But at least he abolished slavery. Number 119. Tong Muzong. He inherited a somewhat restored China, but did fuck all to improve it more. The Xiaodushi would slowly use this lack of challenging to creep back into challenging the government. Corruption was constantly rife, and he spent all of his time drinking and indulging himself, which all sent the Tang dynasty down a downward spiral. Number 118. Jia Tuhan. Well, first of all, he straight up usurped the throne. The civil war that was caused by his usurpation of the throne would lead to the rise of despotic warlords all over Yuan China. He gave extremely generous rewards to those who helped him, and he was dominated by El Timur and Bayan of the Merkid. He lived a life of luxury, though he was a patron of the arts. All in all, his civil war would lead to the weakening of the Yuan dynasty and slowly lead it down a path of a downward spiral. Number 117. Han Aidi. He started off promising, and things very quickly went downhill. There were lots of corruption, high taxes were levied on the people, and to top it all off, there were 4 fucking Empress Dowagers! Because of this, Wang Mang would slowly get more powerful. Also, he was a gay-ass motherfucker in more ways than one. Number 116, the Jia Emperor. He was a cruel emperor who was uninterested in governing and relied on eunuchs to relay his wishes. Take a good long guess at how this will fucking end. Corruption would also eat at the core of the Ming dynasty due to all of this. It was also really fucking creepy. He believed that drinking the menstrual blood of virgins would give him immortality. And after a failed assassination attempt involving a bunch of his maids trying to assassinate him, he moved out of the imperial palace and lived with a small, thin, 13-year-old girl who was, oh no. Number 115. Tuchon Timur. The administration was good at first, but then things quickly went downhill. He lost interest in governing the Yuan dynasty and failed to react properly to natural disasters and famines, which all led to popular discontent, and he was dominated by several people. This all culminated in the Red Turban Rebellion, which overthrew the Yuan dynasty. Number 114. The Chenghua Emperor. He started off by reducing taxes and strengthened the Ming dynasty. Unfortunately, he was very prone to being influenced by others, and governmental affairs fell into the hands of eunuchs. Because of this, peasants rose up in rebellion. In order to deal with this, he established a secret police force, but this would backfire later on down the line and cause massive issues. Number 113. Han Andi. He spent the first part of his reign under the capable regency of Empress Dowager Deng. However, after her death, he decimated the Dengs. After this, he was dominated by and essentially enabled the eunuch faction, which of course has always led to corruption. It was at this point that various vassals started to rebel. Number 112. The Zhengde Emperor. Okay, by all accounts, this guy should be way lower than he is. He lived a luxurious lifestyle, he frequented brothels, he sanctioned the rise of eunuch power, and all of that other stuff that is typically associated with emperors worse than him. However, sometimes he was actually okay. He dealt competently with invasions and rebellions and a bunch of other stuff. Also, the contact with Europe is one of the most cursed things I've ever read. Number 111. Tang Jingzong. He was dominated by eunuchs who controlled the army. He lived a life of decadence, opulence, and he had a severe lack of diligence. And the most unique fact about him is that he died on the toilet. Number 110. Song Huizong. He was an accomplished artist, but he was really incompetent as an emperor. Basically, he didn't give a shit about Jurchen Xin. When Jurchen Xin invaded, Song Huizong pussied out of being an emperor. Still captured though. Number 109. Han Chengdi. He was way too trusting of the Wang clan, which continued to gain more power. Corruption and greedy officials plagued the Han dynasty, and at this point rebellion started to break out. Number 108. Hulu Khan. He handed out titles like candy, and then he went back on this later. He tried to deal with the vast financial problems from extreme spending, but instead worsened inflation, and his successors proceeded to reverse many of his policies after his death. So yeah, at least he dealt with the Chagatai Khan. Number 107. Ming Yingzong. He was basically a child puppet emperor, and then he decided to personally command a battle against the Mongols, which, you know, went as well as you would expect. He dealt with a coup in his second reign. And thus ends the only Ming emperor who is actually named in an orthodox Chinese manner. It's all fucking XY emperors from here on out. Number 106. Jin Wudi. He reunified China after the Three Kingdoms period. In order to prevent something like that from happening again, he decided to empower the nobility, as he saw the lack of power amongst the nobility as a detriment. He also tried to scale back the harshness of laws and reform the government some more. Unfortunately, all of this really only benefited the nobility, and the peasants still lived in the exact same way. He also dealt with outside harassment, he lived an extravagant lifestyle, and he eventually passed the throne to his developmentally disabled son. All of this combined with the empowered nobility led to the disastrous War of the Eight Princes, which would send China down a downward spiral. Number 105. Song Qingzong. You know, maybe if I renege on this treaty and attack Jurchen Jin, despite what happened last time, and not reinforce the northern border, despite knowing what Jurchen Jin is capable of, they'll leave us alone. Song Qingzong. Number 104. Hai Hun Ho. Bro, this guy was an actual fucking dumbass. He didn't observe mourning properly, and he basically did everything possible to not seem like a worthy candidate for emperor. He got deposed after only 27 days. Number 103. Jin Aidi. He was dominated by Huan Wen and Sima Yu, and he took mercury pills. That's it. Number 102. Han Xuandi. He was a very kind person, but he was also very incompetent, being easily influenced by corrupt officials. It is at this time that mild rebellions would break out during his reign. Number 101. The Chongjin Emperor. He was the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He tried to stop the decline of the Ming Dynasty, but unfortunately he ended up speeding it up instead. It was at this point that corruption had completely rotted the Ming Dynasty to a point where it was hard to find talent. And a few talented officials that did exist, he executed them out of paranoia. Eventually he lost hope and committed suicide while the Manchus swept over China. You can actually see the tree where he killed himself in Beijing. Number 100. Tang Dezong. He attempted to fight against warlord power, and he actually almost succeeded. But due to various fuck-ups on his part, China became even more divided. He eventually got a dependence on the eunuchs, and we all know how that ends. He also ended up making wealth matter more than merit, ultimately. Number 99. Tang Zhaozong. He was the penultimate emperor of the Tang Dynasty. He attempted to fight against the Jiedu Shi to reassert imperial power, but he was beaten. Liu Maojin would become influential and attain more power, and eventually was deposed after a violent incident. However, he was restored and made a puppet of Zhu Quanzhong. Number 98. The Gongshi Emperor. He seized power and tried to get people to nominally submit to him. Unfortunately, he was weak and incompetent, and was overthrown by the Qimei. Some people just never stood a chance. Number 97. Tang Daizong. He was installed by the corrupt eunuch Li Fuguo, and then he proceeded to depose Li Fuguo in a plot. He defeated the last remnants of the Anshi rebellion, but he allowed the rebellion generals to remain Jiedu Shi in order to smoothen the transition of power, which kicked off a period of warlordism. He collaborated with various eunuchs to murder other corrupt eunuchs. However, that made the eunuchs that helped him become more corrupt, and various corrupt officials would become even more powerful during his reign. Number 96. Tang Zhongzong. He spent his first brief reign dominated by Wu Zetian before being deposed in favor of someone else, and his second reign was fought between his wife and his sister. Corruption ran rampant, though to be fair to him, he cemented peace between the Tang Dynasty and Tibet. Number 95. Song Ninzong. He had to deal with rising inflation, and he also commissioned a general to attempt to invade Jurchenxin after it experienced various disasters. He failed brutally. He was also a patron of the arts, and he's notable for being the emperor who watched Jurchenxin get anally fucked by Genghis Khan, and he was also dominated by his wife, confirming that yes, an emperor can be a beta cuck. Number 94. Han Huaidi. He was the second emperor of the Han Dynasty, and he was dominated by Empress Dowager Liu. He later indulged in women and wine after giving up trying to govern, because Empress Dowager Liu did some really horrifying shit, like what the fuck. He eventually died depressed, though he still helped establish the Han Dynasty, so I'll give him some props. Number 93. Song Guangzong. He was dominated by his wife. He dismissed Xin Cici, whose name I am definitely mispronouncing, and who also planned to take a much more aggressive stance against Jurchenxin. He became an alcoholic, and he was deposed due to a lack of filial piety. I keep waiting for someone who I can talk more about, but all of these emperors are just you know. Number 92. Song Gaozong. He re-established the Song Dynasty. However, at this point, it couldn't do anything against Jurchenxin, so they negotiated a peace treaty which ceded northern China to Jurchenxin, but resulted in peace and lucrative trade. However, the act for which he is best known for was that he collaborated with the Chancellor Qin Hui to execute Yue Fei on trumped-up charges, which for many people is an unforgivable act. Number 91. Jin Yuandi. He was basically fucked over from the start. His reign saw the loss of northern China, though this wasn't really his fault, as he had to deal with the fallout of the War of the Eight Princes and the start of the 16 Kingdoms period. He never tried to regain northern China, though given the state of the Qin dynasty at the time, this is understandable. He also had a humiliating loss to Wang Dun and died soon afterwards. Number 90. Han Hoshao. This guy was literally a straight-up puppet, and even after Empress Dowager Lu's death, he was still dominated by the Liu clan. He was deposed and replaced with his much better uncle. Number 89. The Tongzhi Emperor. He tried to salvage the Qing dynasty, however due to control by Empress Dowager Suzi and political intrigue, his programs failed. Number 88. Xin Huaidi. He tried to pass reforms to help the dynasty recover from devastation, but unfortunately he was thoroughly dominated by Sima Yue. Due to Sima Yue's idiocy, Han Zhao proceeded to screw the empire over. He dealt with Sima Yue, but left the capital more open to Han Zhao, and he was captured in the disaster of Yongjia. Number 87, Tang Wenzong. He sought to be a responsible ruler after the prior reigns, which is commendable, but unfortunately he was very indecisive. He defeated Li Tongzhi, but was then defeated by He Jintao. There was rampant factionalism, and he attempted to fight against eunuch power, but the Gandu incident happened instead, and he became really depressed afterwards. Number 86, Qin Wang Ziying. He inherited a broken empire and had to style himself as merely a king because the state was so weak at the time, and he eventually got beaten by Liu Bang and got deposed. We'll see Liu Bang later on in this list. Number 85, Qin Mingdi. He inherited a beaten and broken Qin dynasty. The capital was very poor after the disaster of Yongxia, and he relied on uncontrollable vassals to protect him, and eventually he was captured. Number 84, Tang Jizong. He had to deal with Huangchao, famine, war, and a multitude of rebellions. Hell, even the capital was briefly taken by Huangchao. This rebellion was crushed, but the Jiedu became even more powerful as a result of that. What the fuck did this guy do to deserve this? Number 83, Song Renzong. He was actually a pretty swell guy, but he also oversaw a breakdown of military power of the Song dynasty, which would have very negative consequences later down the line. He also paid massive bribes to enemies, which resulted in heavy taxation and resulted in many civilians living in poverty. Though to be fair, he did rule over the cultural high point of the Song dynasty. Number 82, the Longqing Emperor. He had to deal with the damage that his father's long reign did. He re-employed talented officials, restarted trade, repulsed the Mongols. However, he still relied heavily on the court eunuchs, and he would eventually forego his duties as a ruler after seeing a female Turkish dancer. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, even an emperor can be a simp. Number 81, Raghiba Khan. He was installed by Dalit Shah, which triggered an uprising that saw him ousted, in form of the War of the Two Capitals. Raghiba Khan would soon disappear after losing. Number 80, Yang Dong. I'm not actually entirely sure if this guy is an emperor or not. He had to fight against multiple different states competing over control of China, and he got deposed. Number 79, Song Gongdi. He was only 4 years old when he became emperor, and his entire reign was under the regency of Empress Dowager Se. He was depowered by the Mongols and proceeded to live a quiet life as a noble. Number 78, Qin Huidi. He was the second Qin dynasty ruler, and as mentioned earlier, he was very developmentally disabled. Because of this, he needed various regions to rule over for him. Due to all of this, relatives spent the entirety of his reign warring over regency over him, which crippled the Qin dynasty and set the stage for the 16 Kingdoms period. However, since he was developmentally disabled, and all of that was caused by his family warring over him, he shouldn't be blamed for this. Number 77, Qin Fei Di. He was largely in the hands of Sima Yu and Huan Wen. He lost to Luo Yang, though that wasn't really his fault, and he was eventually deposed by Huan Wen. Number 76, Han Qianshao. He was literally a child puppet emperor of Empress Dowager Liu. He found out that his mother was killed, and stated that he will find who did it when he's an adult. Unfortunately for him, the perpetrator was Empress Dowager Liu. He would shortly be murdered afterwards. Number 75, Pu Yi. He was the last emperor of China, discluding whatever the fuck Yuan Shikai was trying to do. He ascended the throne at age 2, and was deposed when he was 6 years old, except for when he was briefly restored when he was 11. After this, he would go from being a private citizen to a fascist puppet emperor to being a prisoner, and finally being a hardline communist before dying. Number 74, Ru Ziying. He was literally a fucking baby. He got deposed by Wang Mang after he decided to officially claim power. He proceeded to have a really fucking depressing life, but despite being a baby when he ascended the throne and ruling for 2 years, he's still better than 40% of the emperors here. What the fuck? Number 73, Han Shangdi. He was another baby and he got struck by infant mortality. Number 72, Jin Andi. He was even more developmentally disabled than the earlier guy, and he couldn't even tell if he was hungry or not. Regents, warlords, and rebellions would plague the Jin dynasty. Number 71, Han Chongdi. He was literally a toddler. He died early because 50% of children didn't survive until 5 back then. Number 70, Rinchen Belhan. He ascended the throne when he was 6 and died 2 months in. Number 69, Song Duanzong. He was 6 years old. He fled to Hong Kong after the Mongols conquered most of China, and he was killed by childhood disease. Number 68, Zhao Bing. He was between 6 and 7 years old. What was left of the Song at the time engaged the Yuan at the Battle of Yanmen, which was a decisive Yuan victory. After this victory, his Grand Chancellor carried him to a cliff where they proceeded to throw themselves off, killing themselves. Number 67. Han Ping-di. He was a child puppet emperor of Wang Mang, and as he grew up, it became clear that he resented Wang Mang, and he was killed by him to prevent him from avenging his family. Number 66. Bei Xiangho. He was apparently pretty young when he ascended the throne, and he died in the same year. Number 65. Yasun Timur. He was installed following the coup d'etat at Nanpo. He secured support from the Han populace, and he kept a majority of the officials as Mongols with some Muslim Turkic peoples. He forbade the lamas from entering China, and he divided China into 18 departments. Number 64. Song Yingzong. He was known for some controversy over correct rituals. He left the officials of Guangnam West Circuit to fend for themselves, and he commissioned Sima Guang to write a universal history of China. Number 63. Hu Tuktuchen. He became emperor after Jaya Tuchen abdicated, and he died after a banquet. Foul play may or may not have been involved. Number 62. Liu Bian. He was the 13-year-old son of the 5th worst emperor on this list, and he got deposed by Dong Zhuo after reigning for a few months. Number 61. Han Zhidi. He was literally a 7-year-old, but was still more aware of how abusive people can be with power than lots of people on this list. He told Liang Xi it was an arrogant piece of shit. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that's the general idea. And Liang Xi proceeded to fucking murder him. Number 60. Xin Gongdi. He was essentially dominated by Liu Yu, who eventually deposed him. Liu Yu would actually go on to become a pretty good emperor. However, since I'm not counting Northern and Southern dynasties, he will not be appearing on this list. This is the last emperor of the Qin dynasty. Number 59. Yang Hao. He was dominated by Yuan Huazi, and he was effectively put under house arrest. He was later murdered by Yuan Huazi. Number 58. Tang Shangdi. He was installed briefly by Empress Dowager Wei, who had imperial ambitions. He was deposed in a coup which saw Empress Dowager Wei killed. Number 57. Tang Aidi. He was a puppet emperor of Zhu Chuanzhong who proceeded to murder a lot of his family and then Tang Aidi. He was the last emperor of the Tang dynasty. Number 56. Han Xiandi. He was the last emperor of the Han dynasty and was used as a massive legitimacy boost for the entirety of his reign. He was deposed after Cao Pi decided that it wasn't worth pretending that he had real power. He spent the rest of his life in relative comfort. Number 55. Yang Yu. He was basically the last emperor of the Sui dynasty depending on who you ask. He was installed as emperor by Li Yuan, and he was then deposed by Li Yuan, who we'll see much later. Number 54. Qin Chongdi. He became emperor when he was 4 and spent a lot of his reign under regency. While his regency was happening, he oversaw a lot of central China lost to later Zhao. However, when he took the reins of actual power, northern and central Chinese refugees were registered within their new commanderies, which greatly bolstered manpower. Number 53. Timur Han. He managed to achieve suzerainty over the entire Mongol realm and managed to get Burma and Sukhothai to pay tribute. Despite this, he couldn't curb the vast corruption and inefficiencies of the Yuan dynasty. Number 52. Xin Kandi. He only ruled for about 2 years. He actually approved of a major campaign against later Zhao, but this was never carried out for some reason. Number 51. The Qianwen Emperor. He set free many victims of the Hongwu's emperor's purges. He restrained the eunuchs, and he cracked down on the influence of imperial princes. However, this resulted in Zhu Di rebelling and overthrowing the emperor. Zhu Di would actually go on to be a pretty good emperor later on. Number 50. The Guangxu Emperor. He was the penultimate emperor of China in general. He inherited a humiliated China and tried to pass a series of sweeping reforms aimed at modernizing the country. Unfortunately, Empress Dowager Cixi staged a counter-coup, which resulted in his removal from power, being held under house arrest, and his eventual poisoning. As a result of his house arrest, Japan and the Western powers would inflict humiliating defeats on China, and it wasn't helped by officials literally ignoring his orders. Maybe if he was in better circumstances, he would have actually been a great emperor. Number 49. Tang Ruizong. He spent his first reign being dominated by Wu Zetian. In his second reign, he reversed many bad decisions that were made by his predecessors. However, he was still dominated by Taiping. Eventually, he had enough and peacefully passed it to Li Longzi, who we'll see soon. Number 48. Xin Mudi. He ascended to the throne at age 1. The Xin dynasty expanded to its greatest size since the fall of northern China during his reign. However, since this is all achieved by his regents, this won't go towards him. Overall, he's okay, I guess. Number 47, Jin Jianwen. He would have a confrontation with Huan Wen based off of Sima Zi. He agreed to depower him, but he wouldn't kill him. After this, both of the people in the confrontation would die. Number 46, the Xuande Emperor. He ruled during the height of the Ming Dynasty. He recognized the existence of Vietnam in order to deal with the Mongols. He also ordered tax reductions for burdened farmers. However, during all of this, he tried to reform the military, which failed. He trusted a greater authority in eunuchs, and he lived an extravagant lifestyle, all of which would combine to end the Ming Golden Age. Overall, he ruled over a very peaceful period. However, some of his policies would result in problems after his death. He was also a pretty good painter. Number 45, Tang Xuanzong. He was very sickly and would die within 1 year. But despite this, he kick-started a number of reforms that would help reassert imperial authority after the An Lushan Rebellion. Number 44. The Taichung Emperor ascends throne, repeals unpopular policies, fills important bureaucratic positions, shits self, refuses to elaborate, dies after 1 month. Number 43. Yin Han. He spent the start of his reign as a puppet emperor, however he broke out of this and proceeded to dismantle the powerful Hun Girod faction. After this, he would become a much more Chinese emperor, which is a bad or good thing depending on how you look at the whole thing. He was eventually deposed at the coup d'etat at Nanpo. Number 42, Jin Mindi. He decisively defeated Wang Dun, who would die after this. He posthumously awarded those who would die at Wang Dun's hands. He would die afterwards. Now this is good and all until you realize that this guy is the best person on this list from the Jin dynasty. The best person from an entire dynasty. C tier. Good god, what a shitty fucking dynasty, man. Number 41, the Wanli Emperor. His early reign was spent reforming the government, which would make China experience an age of prosperity that wasn't seen in a while. However, the achievements of his early reign could be chalked up to Zhang Zhuzhong as a regent. In his middle reign, he kept a lot of these reforms while being engaged in conflict, crushing rebellions while supporting the Koreans against the Japanese invasion. That was led by Toyotomi Hideyoshi. In his late reign, he grossly neglected his duties as emperor, resulting in decline. Number 40, Tang Xuanzong. His first half of his reign was the pinnacle of the Tang dynasty, and arguably of China as well. He dealt with scheming in court effectively, he ordered an extermination campaign of locusts to ward off famine, and he won against the Tibetans, though he did lose against the Chudan. However, over the course of his long reign, he gradually became much less interested in ruling. He became way too trusting of officials like Li Linfu, Gao Lishi, and most importantly, An Lushan. It's also worth noting that they lost the Battle of Talis against the Abbasid Caliphate, which would permanently end Chinese expansion into Central Asia. Eventually, due to all of his negligence, the An Lushan Rebellion would break out at the end of his reign, which would devastate the Tang dynasty. Number 39, the Jintai Emperor. He repaired the Grand Canal and other existing infrastructure and was then overthrown in a military coup. Number 38, Song Shenzong. He appointed Wang Anshi as chancellor, who pushed policies that improved lives all around. He also hired Muslim mercenaries to invade and settle Liao dynasty territory. However, he also sent failed campaigns against Western Xia and Vietnam. Number 37, Song Zhizong. He was under the regency of Empress Dowager Gao, who halted the new policies. However, after her death, he reinstated the new policies. He forced Western Xia to become more peaceful. However, unfortunately, he couldn't stop infighting in the court before he died of diarrhea. Number 36, Han Yuandi. During his reign, victory over the Xiongnu was achieved. The Han dynasty would now have complete dominion over Central Asia and could expand trade. However, at the same time, his reign was plagued by growing factionalism and court intrigue, with officials literally fucking murdering each other during this whole thing. Number 35, Han He. He spent the early part of his reign under the domination of Empress Dowager Dou, whom he would eventually set off a coup against with eunuchs. This involved eunuchs more in politics, which, at this point, we all know how that ends. Other than all of that, he ruled as a decent but unremarkable emperor. Number 34, Song Zhenzong. You know what? This guy is the first one on this entire list that I would actually consider to be a good emperor. The previous emperors behind him were okay to terrible, so we finally got a good one. Good job, guys, after 97 of them. So how was he as an emperor? Well, he strengthened the position of the Song dynasty, he improved agriculture, and he concluded a treaty with the Northern Liao dynasty, which resulted in a century of peace. This would come back to haunt this Song, however. He also spent the last 2 years under regency from his wife after a serious illness. So yeah, pretty good actually. Number 33, Song Taizong. He rose up to power in very suspicious circumstances. He may or may not have murdered his brother in order to take the throne. Otherwise, he was actually pretty good. He expanded on the literary and economic policies of his brother, he initiated construction projects, and most importantly of all, he conquered northern Han, thus uniting more of China, which was lost during the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. However, he did wage failed campaigns in the Liao Dynasty in order to get more territory back. Number 32, the Shunzhi Emperor. He was the first Qing emperor to actually rule over China. He spent the first part of his reign under Duerguen's regency. Duerguen would be responsible for the conquest of China by the Manchus, and after taking power, he would order several unpopular decrees, committing massacres, destroying many institutions, and the worst of all, forcing every Han Chinese male to have a yee-ass haircut. However, since he is under regency, the Shunzhi emperor is not actually blamed for any of this, and after actually taking the reins of power, he dedicated his reign to fighting corruption, he revived many Chinese institutions that had been previously disbanded, and he campaigned against the Silver Ming, though he would eventually die of smallpox. Number 31, Tang Wuzong. He dealt with rebellions that were happening against the imperial government, and he dealt with outside invasions. Overall, he was a capable emperor. However, one stain on his reign was that he was a massive bigot. He is known mostly for his persecution of Buddhists, however, he also persecuted Zoroastrians, he persecuted Nestorian Christians, and he persecuted Manichaeans. Number 30, Tang Gaozong. At the beginning of his reign, the government was actually run fairly well. He listened to the advice of Zhang Sun Wuzi and Chu Sui-liang, and the Western Turks were conquered during this time. However, Turkic rebellions would have to constantly be dealt with throughout his reign. However, what his reign is mostly known for is the absolute shit ton of court intrigue, which drags down his reign a bit, and most of it was around Wu Zetian, who would slowly amass more and more power until she was basically de facto running the entire empire, though she was actually very competent, as we'll see later. Also, according to Wikipedia, take this with a grain of salt because it's Wikipedia, he apparently built the first mosque in China, which is pretty interesting. Number 29, Bu Yantuchen. As far as Yuan Dynasty emperors go, he was actually pretty good. He reformed the government based off of Confucian principles, he reintroduced the imperial examination system, and he codified the law. Unfortunately for him, Timur would fuck up various aspects of his reign. Number 28, Tang Xuzong. He spent the entirety of his reign putting down the Anlushan rebellion, eventually managing to recapture Chang'an from the rebellious forces. Now, as you can probably notice, the B-tier emperors throughout this section would usually be pretty good emperors otherwise, but they did one bad thing throughout their reign that screwed something up for their successors, and this is no different from here. In the case of Tang Xuzong, it was his failure to deal properly with court intrigue. More power would fall into eunuch hands, and we all know how that ends, and several officials would end up having a power struggle while he was busy dealing with the rebellion. Overall, he was a good emperor in terms of his dealing with the rebellion, but his failure to deal with court intrigue would be a detriment. Number 27, the Jiaqing Emperor. He had the thankless job of cleaning up after his father's long reign. He did this by quelling rebellions and consolidating control over an enlarged China, prosecuting corrupt officials, and a bunch of other stuff. However, it's worth noting that he did persecute Christians, which, assuming that God does exist, may have contributed to him being struck by lightning and dying afterwards. It is significantly more likely that he died due to a stroke from being mega obese. Number 26, Han Zhengdi. Overall, he was actually a very solid emperor. He was diligent and frugal, and he promoted honest officials to better run the country. Han society would flourish during this period, and his reign, along with the reign of his predecessor, would be remembered as a golden age of the Eastern Han dynasty. However, court intrigue involving Empress Dowager Do would set a precedent which would tear apart the Han dynasty and eventually lead to its end. Number 25, the Hongxi Emperor. Well, he dismantled unpopular military policies, and he also focused on civil governing. He gave high ranks to close advisors, and he improved finances and lessened the burden on vagrant farmers. Even though he died early after just 1 year, his reforms were carried on by his son. However, his treatment of Zhonghe would come to bite China back less than 400 years later. Number 24, Han Jingdi. Before he rose up to power, literally everyone thought he was going to be a shit emperor. As it turns out though, he was actually pretty solid. Granted, it was very easy for him to be solid because his job was essentially don't fuck up the policies of your father, and he didn't fuck up. He also quelled the rebellion of the 7 states and would centralize power. Unfortunately, his reign also featured some political intrigue. Ultimately, all of this would pave the way for the reign of his son. We'll get to his son later. Number 23, Tang Xianzong. He spent his reign curbing the power of the Jiedu Shi. After dealing with several warlords, he actually managed to reassert imperial authority. This was dubbed as the Yuanhe Restoration. He did rely on some eunuchs to do this, however. Overall, he was actually one of the last good emperors of the Tang dynasty. Number 22, Han Zhaodi. He had to clean up after the glorious but expensive reign of his father. He tried to do this by reducing government spending, and he also lowered taxes for the average people. He also had to deal with political intrigue as well, though there was a controversial incident involving Luo Lan. Number 21, Song Jiaozong. He increased trade, he stabilized the economy, and he reached peace with Zhejiang Xin. However, his biggest legacy was in terms of Chinese culture in general. You see, he was the man who was responsible for posthumously rehabilitating Yue Fei's image after he was wrongly executed by one of his predecessors, as mentioned earlier. This has had a great cultural impact on China, where today Yue Fei is considered to be a national folk hero. Number 20, Wu Zetian. She's notable for being the only empress regnant in Chinese history. Though before officially proclaiming herself to be an empress, she was actually the real power behind the throne for several years. So, how was she as an empress? She was actually pretty good. She was a diligent and competent administrator, she had an eye for talent and was really good at selecting officials who were great at the job, and she commissioned generals to retake territory from the Tibetan Empire. Overall, she is a very competent empress. However, the rise to her power and the secret police she employed will forever be a stain on her rule. Also, she was a pretty shit parent. Number 19, the Hongzhi Emperor. He was a hardworking emperor who supervised all affairs of state and made wise decisions in who to hire for the job. He actually created a state of cooperation. This was rare during the time when he was emperor, and he introduced a much more transparent Ming government. This allowed the people to thrive, along with his religious toleration and the curtailing of the eunuch's power. Overall, a very good emperor. Number 18, Han Mingdi. He was a very attentive and capable emperor. He stamped out corruption amongst the government. He built a Confucian school that would become the first imperial university. He engaged in fighting the northern Xiongnu, and he won. And he also honored the officials who helped him through all of this. Admittedly, there were 2 mass executions that stained his reign. Number 17, Han Xuandi. He actually spent the first years of his life in prison, but he was eventually elevated to the status of prince before ascending the imperial throne. And these honest roots definitely helped him be the kind and responsible emperor that he was known as. He promoted honest officials and stamped out corruption. He actually crippled the western part of the Xiongnu Empire, and he was generally a great emperor. Admittedly, there was the destruction of the Huo clan, and he became much less disciplined in later years and started becoming a lazier emperor, but overall he was very good. Easy choice for the beginning of A tier. Number 16, Han Wendi. After the upheaval around Empress Dowager Lu, his diligent and relaxed hand was a welcome change. This rule was known for its very general stability and generosity. He abolished a law that permitted arrest of the criminals' family members. He created a proto-welfare system. Overall, he is remembered as one of the most benevolent rulers in Chinese history. Number 15, Kublai Khan. Yeah, I bet you didn't expect to see him this far up on the list. So, how was he as an emperor of China? Well, after consolidating control over China and minimizing the power of the regional lords and actually governing the empire, he was actually pretty good. He was a patron of the sciences and arts, he expanded public infrastructure, and notably he created the first unified paper money, though this wasn't too good in the long term, but it was a start. Admittedly, in terms of actual Mongol emperors, he was pretty lousy. However, we're evaluating Chinese emperors, and in terms of a Chinese perspective, he is actually pretty solid. Number 14. Tang Gaozu. He was the first emperor of the Tang dynasty. After beating the earlier Sui dynasty, he actually strived to emulate Sui Wendi in his legal and administrative policies. This resulted in lots of political stability and economic prosperity throughout the entire empire. Unfortunately, he also had to deal with lots of infighting between his sons, and eventually he passed it on to Li Shimin, who we'll see much later on. Number 13. Han Guangwu. He was responsible for consolidating China after the turmoil that was created at the end of Wang Mang's reign. He is known for always using peaceful methods first and only using violence as a last resort. Overall, his rule was known for its thriftiness, efficiency, and more lenient laws. On top of that, he intelligently played the Xiongnu against each other. These policies of his probably extended the Han dynasty an extra century in terms of its lifespan. So if you really think about it, he was essentially the Han dynasty equivalent of Constantine the Great. Number 12. Song Taizu. He was the first emperor of the Song dynasty. After pulling off what is possibly the most peaceful coup in Chinese history and reuniting most of China proper, he managed to end the era of warlords, which had been for a long time absolutely detrimental to the country. What's more is that he was a patron of the arts, sciences, and economics, which would set the tone for the rest of the Song dynasty, which is still remembered as a cultural high point in Chinese history. Number 11. Tang Xuanzong. Now, I know what you guys are thinking, but Taiga, didn't you just cover this guy back in C tier? Well, no. These guys are two different people. You see, Mandarin Chinese is a tonal language, and different tones can mean different things. The last guy, back in C tier, was pronounced with an upper tone in Xuan, while this guy's pronounced with a flatter tone. Xuan. Now about tones, how was he? Well, he was the last capable emperor of the Tang dynasty. He acted against dominating officials, which largely ended the factionalism. He took advantage of the chaos in Tibet to retake several lost territories, and he dealt with Tangut rebellions by simply putting honest officials in charge. In terms of administration, he ruled attentively and tried to rule like the earlier Tang Taizong, who we'll see much later. He also tried to deal with the eunuch problem, but unfortunately he couldn't find a good way to. And eventually he died like so many Chinese emperors before him did, ingesting mercury. Number 10. The Yongle Emperor. He stabilized China's countryside and economy after it was devastated by his revolt against the emperor. He rebuilt the Grand Canal, he crushed the remnants of the Yuan dynasty, and conquered Vietnam. He also sponsored Zheng He's exploration of the world. On top of that, he promoted Confucianism and Chinese culture, and his reign is generally considered to be a high point in the Ming dynasty. He was a bit tyrannical, however. Number 9. The Hongwu Emperor. He was born in poverty, but he slowly rose the social ladder until he overthrew the Yuan dynasty. He made lots of land reforms and distributed more land to peasants, and also undertook several infrastructure projects to help support the farmers and reform rural Chinese communities. On top of all of this, he kept a powerful but still subordinate army, he set a comprehensive legal code, he emphasized agriculture above merchants who he regarded as parasitic, and expanded the imperial examinations. On top of that, he was very tolerant of minorities within the Ming Empire. However, one detriment to his reign was that he was very tyrannical. He straight up abolished the position of chancellor and put many draconian measures, and was later responsible for executions of several thousands of people. Number 8. The Qianlong Emperor. He was the second longest reigning emperor in Chinese history, though unofficially he was actually the longest. He was a patron of culture and the arts, but at the same time he still worked hard to keep the Qing dynasty's Manchu character. He built several public works, and he ruled the Qing dynasty at its zenith, which boasted the largest population and economy in the world. Most noticeable of his achievements is that he launched 10 great campaigns, which altogether brought China to the largest size that it has ever been to date. With all of this, you may be asking me, well, Taigo, why the hell isn't he higher up? Well, towards the end of his reign, he kind of stopped really caring about ruling, drunken off power. Corruption, draining of finances, and other factors existed at the end of his reign and would be the downfall of the Qing dynasty. And I think this is best summarized by the Earl McCartney in one of his letters. Quote, "The Empire of China is an old, crazy, first-rate man of war, which a fortunate succession of able and vigilant officers have contrived to keep afloat for these 150 years past, and to overawe their neighbors merely by her bulk and appearance. But whenever an insufficient man happens to have the command on deck, adieu to the discipline and safety of the ship. She may perhaps not sink outright, she may drift sometime as a wreck, and will then be dashed to pieces on the shore, but she can never be rebuilt on the old bottom." Truthfully, I think this summarizes his later reign as well, hence why he is not higher up on the list. He started off as a great emperor, he continued as a good emperor who did many great things over the course of his reign. However, by the end of his reign, he set the stage for worse things to happen to China, and eventually an entire century of humiliation. Number 7. The Yongzheng Emperor. He is quite possibly the most underrated Chinese emperor, and the reason for this is that he kind of usurped the throne after competing with his brothers to seize the throne and treated them brutally afterwards. But other than that, he was actually very good. Basically, he had to deal with the massive drain on the treasury that his father's reign left. In order to do this, he reformed how officials were appointed, he cracked down on corruption, reformed the financial system to be less of a drain, and increased the amount of farmland, and set up special exams in orphanages to let more minorities have positions, and he also expanded northwest. This basically resulted in the treasury increasing, which set the stage for the reign of his son. So yeah, he was actually very good, and he's mostly just hated because of how he got his power. Number 6. The man, the myth, the legend, Qin Shi Huang. Yes, the first emperor of China. Without him, China wouldn't be what it is today. He was by far the most influential out of all of the emperors on this entire list. Aside from, uniting China in the first place, he also abolished the feudal system and instituted a more centralized system that would be followed up all until 1912. He standardized the scripts and measurements, he built a series of roads and transportation systems all around the empire, and he ordered the construction of the Great Wall and the Lingzhou Canal. He also instituted the bureaucratic and meritocratic system that China would be defined by for the next 1,000 years. However, admittedly, he was a massive tyrant. He ordered burnings of books and ruled harshly under strict legalism. He also buried many Confucian scholars alive and censored the histories of the lands that he conquered. However, while all of these were bad, I generally believe that the good outweighs the bad in this scenario, which is why I've placed him at such a high place, even though wherever I place him is bound to be a bit controversial. Number 5. Sui Wendi. After centuries of division and China being plunged into a dark age, Sui Wendi was the man to reunite China, and it was exactly what it needed. He reorganized the bureaucracy to become more efficient, he commissioned a canal to make food transportation easier, and he dealt with outside forces effectively. It was said that his reign was so prosperous that food stores could last 50 years. It was honestly a shame that his son was such a piece of shit. At this point, we have now finished ranking most of the emperors on this list. The next 4 emperors on this list are, in my opinion, the greatest emperors in Chinese history. However, before we get to them, here are a few honorable mentions. Alright, now that we're done with the honorable mentions, or as I like to call it, all the emperors who were pretty good, however, didn't succeed in the criteria outlined in the beginning, so they weren't included in the main list. Now that we're done with that section, we can finally move on to the 4 best emperors on this list. Number 4, the Kangxi Emperor. He was officially the longest reigning Chinese emperor ever. He consolidated China after the conquest of it by the Manchus by his predecessor. While he was initially under the control of regents, with the help of his grandmother, he would take the reins of power, crushing the revolt of the free feudatories. After this, he would go on to win campaigns against Taiwan, Russia, the Dzungars, and Tibet, greatly expanding Chinese territory. If this is not enough, he was also a great patron of culture and the arts. He commissioned a Kangxi dictionary, he compiled Tang poetry, and he was overall a patron of Chinese culture. Overall, he was a very diligent emperor, always rising early and retiring late in order to attend to all affairs of state. However, he is not any higher than he is on this list, because at the end of his reign there was a sizable amount of corruption and draining of finances that his successor would have to deal with. Number 3. Han Gaozu. He rose from a minor law enforcer to one of the leaders of a rebellion, which would eventually overthrow the Qing dynasty. After winning the Chu-Han contention against Xiongnu, he would establish the Han dynasty, which would go on to become one of the greatest Chinese dynasties to ever exist. Owing to his humble roots, he genuinely cared for the people. He reduced taxes, he relaxed laws, and he promoted Confucianism over the stark legalism that was common back in the earlier dynasty. Now, was he perfect? Of course not. He lost a very embarrassing defeat against the Xiongnu, and after his death there would be the general upheaval around Empress Dowager Lu, but otherwise he was a very good emperor. A good way to think about him is that he is essentially the Caesar Augustus of the East. Number 2. Han Wudi. Now, if Han Gaozu was the Eastern equivalent of Caesar Augustus, then Han Wudi would be the Eastern equivalent of Trajan. He was the longest ruling emperor until the Kangxi Emperor nearly 2,000 years later. He was also one of the greatest conquerors in Chinese history. He conquered what is now southern China and Vietnam as well. He conquered the northern part of Korea, and he expelled the Xiongnu from the Ordos Desert and the Qilian Mountains. The Xiongnu, of course, having been a massive thorn in the China side for a long time at that point. He also reformed the government to reduce corruption and basically gave Imperial China its ideology. He established Confucianism as an important imperial ideology, or more accurately, legalism with Confucian characteristics, which actually somewhat persists to this day with some changes to it, obviously. Admittedly, one major problem with his reign was that he became a massive despot in his late reign. His conquests drained the treasury, which led to him levying higher taxes on the people, and also the people revolting. He also killed thousands of people out of paranoia. However, he would eventually apologize for his despotism in the repenting Edict of Lun Tai, and he followed by trying to seize the hardships of the people. To top it off, he founded the Imperial University and was a patron of the arts and music. Well, we made it. There's only one emperor left. And coincidentally, this emperor is also the only emperor to ever actually make it into S tier in this list. Without further ado, the emperor is... Number 1. Tang Taizong. He reformed how the empire was divided to be a much more efficient administrator. He routinely inspected governors to see if they were capable. He won multiple campaigns against the Tuhuyun, the Tibetans, and he won more campaigns against Karashar and Zhueyuantuo, though admittedly he did lose against Goguryeo. On top of that, he listened to criticism and adjusted his rule based off of the advice that his advisors were giving him. He was tolerant of religious groups and he genuinely cared about the people he was ruling. He would set the standard for every single Tang emperor after him, and his reign actually became studied by many Tang princes. The very best of all, he crushed the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, which had been for a long time a thorn in the side of China. This allowed much more trade routes to be opened between the East and the West. In a world with a ravaged Byzantine Empire, an essentially non-existent Sasanian Persian Empire, and an only emerging caliphate, all of this would turn Tang China into arguably the most prosperous state in not just Asia, but the world at the time. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you were able to get at least some enjoyment out of this video. Stay tuned next time when I rank every single Persian emperor from worst to best. That was a joke, guys. That was a joke, guys. I am never going to do this again.